Now, I think I have teed up our next speaker well. I hope so. I think you're going to find this fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Able to build on what we just talked about, the 5 pillars of safety culture and all that. Let me Massachusetts Institute of Technology Engineering Systems Laboratory. His research at MIT studies engineering mistakes and human errors in order to identify gaps and improvements in the way systems are built and operated. He collaborates extensively with the aircraft manufacturers, airline operators, regulators, and even DoD groups. Brothers and sisters, help me welcome to the stage Dr. John Thomas.
Perfect. Welcome. I'm John Thomas. I want to talk to you about a systems approach to safety. It's called STAMP. It's become really popular in aviation in the last 10 to 15 years, including a lot of the companies on the list outside. The benefactor L3Harris has been using this, and a number of airlines and others. But I would wager that most of you have not heard of this technique before. It's still relatively new. About a decade ago, I was contacted by an airline that was having a problem with their jet bridge operators. These operators, they have the station and the console, and they were lowering the jet bridge onto the equipment. And it happened many times. So they had a problem. Here's an example. I can't show you the real pictures. I have to stick to public information for the slides. But it's something like this, and it's not good, and then it keeps happening. And they had already tried to fix it. They came up with this sort of post-it note solution, and it says, caution, do not lower the bridge too far. And there's more than this. There's also a procedure, and there's a walk down you do, and some other things. But it wasn't working. And they thought, well, maybe it's just Jim. Jim here is an idiot, doesn't know how to operate this thing. So they fired Jim, but guess what? The next guy did the exact same thing. And they did it in multiple cities. It's happening all over the place. So they had a problem. They said, John, can you help? And I said, yeah, I can. I can tell you why it wasn't effective. It comes to the roots of the entire field of human factors. Human factors had this aha moment that changed aviation forever. In World War II, we had these aircraft that was being flown by the best pilots. They would land the plane perfectly and then raise the landing gear. This damages the aircraft. But it kept happening. And they would say, you idiot, you're out. And guess what? His replacement would do the same thing. It was baffling. And it was happening in 3 aircraft, P-47s, B-17s, B-25s. And the B-17, it happened 450 times in 2 years. This is insane. I mean, how stupid can you be, right? And so they said, well, obviously, they weren't smart enough. So we came up with these big, complex IQ tests to figure out what makes a good pilot. And we're going to measure their intelligence. Pilots, smartest pilots, would get in there and do the same thing. I said, I guess it's not intelligence. So clearly it's training. We're not training the pilots enough. We're not telling heads. We're going to write the procedures. We're going to review this and have these safety drills. And they did that, and it wasn't effective either. Those guys that went through the training would go out and do the lap of this guy, Lieutenant Alphonse Chapanis. And he said, I got an idea. I'm going to look at the one thing you guys missed. You look so carefully at the inner characteristics of the person and how to change the person, you forgot about the system around them. I'm going to look at the system that you missed. He said, it's interesting to me that this is only happening in these 3 planes. If we put them into a C-47, they'll never make this mistake. So this is sort of on the verge of an epiphany here. It doesn't matter what human you put in the cockpit, they're going to make the error. It matters what cockpit you put the human in. That's the determining factor. So he says, got to be something with this cockpit. So he looked at it. It didn't take long at all. Here's an example of the B-25 cockpit. I don't know if you can see the numbers on the slide, but one of those levers, number 16, is the wing flaps, and number 17 is the landing gear. And so what was happening, the flaps are on the back of the wing in the picture there. When you land the plane, you're supposed to reset the flaps. And so they were grabbing the flaps lever, but accidentally grabbing the landing gear lever. You see, they were trying to do the right thing, actually, and follow the procedure. It wasn't that they were dumb or they didn't understand that this damages the plane. It was that the cockpit didn't make it easy for them to do their job. And enough of a percentage of pilots, even the best pilots we've got, no amount of training or bashing it into their head or firing people was able to fix this. So he had a hypothesis that this human error was caused by the system around them, not by the inner characteristics of the human. He said, I'm going to that it was the human driving the problem. You tried fixing the human, it didn't work, and now it's time to test my hypothesis. Let's change the system around them and see where we get. So this is what he came up with, change the shapes of the controls. This is a modern version of what he did, so that instantly when you touch the wheel, the lever, you feel a wheel or a flap. It's this immediate, simple but very powerful and immediate automatic feedback. You just have to touch it and you instantly know, oh, that's not what I expected. And it was amazingly effective. The accident rate dropped to virtually zero. And it really changed the entire field of aviation. This was a major epiphany that launched the entire field of human factors today. This light bulb moment was this recognition that pilot errors were actually cockpit design errors in disguise. Human error has a cause. It is not a cause of accidents. It has a cause. And it's caused by the system around the people. And this was a turning point, and he's now considered the founder of the entire field of human factors. So back to this jet bridge, I had this idea that maybe it wasn't working because you're so focused on changing the human and no amount of bashing it into their heads was going to work. Maybe it's the same problem Lieutenant Chapani's found. We got to change something about the system. There's something else going on here. So I said, so let's take a look at this system. What can they see and what information do they have? And here's a control panel. You can see a number of inches that you are off the ground in the center there. There's some modes, and you can see if there's faults and other things. So let's map this out. We've got an operator at the station. They can control it by raising and lowering the bridge. This is a downward arrow, the controls they have. And there's an upward arrow, the information that's being presented to them on the console. They can see the height of the bridge off the ground, the mode, the faults, and other things. So what's going on? We've got to be honest about the mistakes that are being made and openly admit what the operators were doing that contributed. And this was it. It's just a fact that they were lowering the bridge when there are obstacles in the way. That's just exactly what was happening. But critically, we've got to understand why. Why did it make sense to them to do this? We can start by looking at what they believe. They all believe that there was enough room to lower. No one is surprised at that, are you? In fact, I bet you could have done this before you did any interviews. You all could have guessed this maybe before an accident happened, which is what I'm going to build up to in a little bit. But they believe there's enough room to lower, and where do the beliefs come from? Turns out humans don't flip a coin mentally to figure out what we're going to believe. Beliefs have a reason. They have a source. Beliefs can be wrong, oh, for sure. But they come from somewhere. Where does this belief come from if it was wrong? Well, beliefs come in part from feedback that they're being presented. And the only way that they could figure out if there's enough room is to do a walk down. If you're 6 feet tall, that means you got to walk all the way down to the pavement through the stairs and then come back up. And when you come back up, things could change. Someone else could move a vehicle. And every 5 minutes or some number of minutes, you got to go down and check again. It's very time consuming, actually, to do this. At the console, you had no help. You can't see the obstacles. Now in Europe, there's some jet bridges with nice windows that you can see clearly, but we don't tend to do that in the US. There's no notification available to them when obstacles appear. There's no proximity sensor or any indication on the screen. And there's also no real effective procedure to contact the guy in the jet bridge with a walkie-talkie to let him know that you just moved some equipment. That wasn't working so well. And too low on the Post-it note was sort of ambiguous. What does too low mean? You're going to get out and measure it with a tape measure? because the display is in inches. And if you're at 96 inches and there's a car underneath, do you have enough room or not? It's extremely error prone, right? So it's actually very understandable why these guys weren't doing such a good job. And we said, all right, so let's test this hypothesis that this error is being induced by the system around them. How are we going to test that? Well, what information do they really need to do a better job? They need to know what's right underneath them, where they're standing. And how do we get that information? You can get really fancy, but maybe you can put a camera. Maybe you don't even need HD. You could use a 40-year-old camera if you wanted to. Those things are $40, $50. And they tried it out. And it was extremely effective. The error rate went almost to zero. Way more effective than anything else they had tried. And this is fascinating to me. You may have noticed these started popping up after this airline did it. Within a year, I saw this at another airline. So, oh, they had the same problem. And then this airline did it. This is just my personal pictures from flying around the world. And everyone started to catch on. It was sort of interesting how it started from trying to bash it into their head, realizing that it's not working, and taking a lesson from human factors that says the most effective way to fix this is to change the system around them. And it actually dates back to the 1800s. 1800s thinking about human decision-making says humans are self-serving. Humans try to maximize personal benefit. The decisions are based on individual benefits and costs to the person. And if you buy into that thinking 200 years ago, the solution is punish and reward the person. And this classical conditioning and psychology and other things. But these ideas are all 100 to 200 years old. These are out. Take a human factors class, you might buy into this, but the entire community worldwide has said this is discredited. The operate is bounded rationality. There's many different terms for this, but this is one of them. Bounded rationality. That term was coined within 10 years of Lieutenant Alphonse Chapin. He's figuring this out in World War II. It was coined by Herbert Simon. He said decisions are based on what makes sense at the time, given the information available in the full context. It's not about this reward-punishment game. It's about what makes sense at the time. And he got the Nobel Prize for that. I hope it's obvious to most of you, but it was actually so profound that he got the Nobel Prize. And then within a few years of that, Tversky and Kahneman said, I'm going to map out exactly what this means and identify a set of biases that make all humans, not just Jim here, who appears to be an idiot, but actually all humans are subject to these biases that distort our decision-making based on bounded rationality. And they got the 2002 Nobel Prize for this. So this is actually the state of the art in human factors and economics and everything else. Solve the problem by providing better information to the people and fixing the system. So there's one lesson to sum up from the last 200 years. It's we've got to understand why bad decisions make sense at the time. Now, this is a great industry to bring this message to because you should all know this already. At least those of you who work with ASAP, this entire foundation of the ASAP program. Safety issues are resolved through corrective action, not through punishment and discipline. And there's a reason why, because that stuff hasn't been as effective. And now, there are some exclusions. They're called the Big Five in the advisory circular. Criminal activity, substance abuse, controlled substances, alcohol, or intentional falsification. Now, if those are happening, then you've got a different problem. You've got an intentional problem that you've got to find a different solution. But as soon as you take those out of the picture, you're left with the vast majority of human error, which is people trying to do their job. So the old 1800s view of human factors says human error is a root cause of most incidents and accidents. And unfortunately, this idea is alive and well from a lot of folks just because it's so trivial and so easy and intuitive to understand. The problem with this view is it really limits your solution space. What are you going to do? If human error is the problem, what are you going to do? You're going to fix the human. That means you can fire them, you can retrain them, you can admonish them, you can give them more rules and procedures. Sometimes I think the procedures are what's getting in the way. They're ill-conceived and overspecified in or underspecified in other problems. But it's okay, we'll throw more procedures in the works and maybe make the problem worse. Or you can get rid of the humans altogether and put in automation, which hasn't been very good in many cases. But that's about it. You're very limited. And perfect Perfectly frustrating example of this is a Colombian accident report for an aircraft crash that found the probable cause was the failure of the flight crew to revert to basic radio navigation at a time when the computer navigation system they were trained to use became so confusing during a critical phase of flight that it demanded an excessive workload at the worst possible time. So this computer was totally poorly designed, so badly it caused massive workload at the worst possible moment, and we don't blame the computer. We find a way to blame the humans for using the computer we told them to use. That's insane. That's the old view creeping in. The new view, which has replaced this for the last 30 years or more, says human error is a symptom, not a cause. These are world-renowned experts that are talking about this. It's not John Thomas here. It's Sidney Dekker, Jens Rasmussen, Nancy Levison, David Woods, and others. And it's a worldwide consensus here. Maybe the first time some of you are hearing this, but it's not just coming from me. The entire world has reached consensus on this a long time ago. All human behavior is affected by the context, the system in which it occurs. To understand human behavior, you've got to look at the system. To create a bad procedure or a bad piece of equipment that caused human error, do you think you could do it? I bet you could. In fact, so when our bad systems are causing operator error, can we really blame the operators rather than the designers of the systems? If you're serious about the system in which it occurs. Look for unintuitive equipment, automation, poor system designs, usefulness of procedures, conflicting information, missing information, just like we saw in the jet bridge example. Human error is a symptom of a system that needs to be redesigned. And by the way, this is not just about safety. In the jet bridge example, when they replaced it with cameras, guess what happened? The delays went down. Productivity went up. You know why? Because they weren't having to go outside and do a walk down every 5 minutes. They had the information there immediately. The system paid for itself in no time and helped them make up for lost time. So it's not just actually about safety, it's about getting insights about efficiency and performance too. How many of you have made a mistake and turned the wrong knob? That's a question with only one answer. The only difference is who's willing to admit it, right? We've all made this mistake, haven't we? So let me try the old view. I'm going to put on the 1800s hat. You idiots! You idiot! You incompetent fools! Can you not read English? Can you not read the words left, right, front, back? How stupid can you be? The answer's right there. The problem is that handicaps the solution space. What am I going to do about that? I know. I'm going to put you in a remedial English language class. It's going to teach you the true meaning of the words left, right, front, back. You think that's going to work? No. I know, I'm going to slap a sticker on it. It says, caution, don't turn the wrong knob. You dummy. That's not going to work. I mean, maybe the first time you see the sticker, you say, huh? But after a week, after a month, after a year, it's not going to work in the long run. I can take away your license to operate the stove. It's you, Jim, out there. It's your fault. You were the first one to make this mistake. I'm going to take away your license. Is that going to prevent the next guy from making this mistake? No, right? But you might say, but John, how can this be anything but human error? It's clearly human error. Human error is caused by being rushed for time pressure. Whoa. You would almost never make that mistake on this system. What did I do? I didn't change the person. I changed the system. This is called natural mapping in human factors. In fact, this is so intuitive and easy, you don't even need labels. Why do we actually have labels on the first system? The next time it occurs to you, oh, I better put a label on that. I better create a procedure for this or a warning. Next time you have that thought, I want you to break it down and realize what you just did in your head. What you just realized is that there's a mismatch between the way people think and the way the system works. And you jump to the conclusion that the only way to resolve the mismatch is to change the way people think. You're going to have limited effectiveness doing that. There's another answer. Change the way the system works to resolve the mismatch. That's by far the most effective answer we have to solve this problem. That's what this does. In fact, this is well recognized. This isn't even new. This is just stuff that we ought to know, but sometimes we don't. In the FAA System Safety Handbook and also in the military standard for military operations, they're in total agreement. And there's lots of others that do this. Safety order precedence. Number one, you want to eliminate the hazards. You want to alter the design to resolve the mismatch. That's by far the most effective approach. The least effective, rock bottom on the things we could do, is add a sign, add a warning label, add a procedure, or create training. Rock bottom. But it's what we always do, isn't it? It's our go-to. And we wonder why it keeps happening, why we keep struggling with this. The right system will reduce human error. That's a fact. There's some opinion in this. Who do you blame for this or that? That's opinion. Let's get down to fact. The fact is the right system will reduce human error, will minimize human error, and a poor system will induce it. When I say system, by the way, I'm not just talking about equipment. I'm talking about everything around the people that do the job, the people they talk to, the procedures that they have, and the other practices that they follow. So if you ever have an accident report that sounds like this, it was caused by human error, period. That's a real strong indicator that you're in the 1800s view. And you really should read up on human factors and do a better job. If you say human operator was distracted and that's it, and you don't go any further, or they were violating procedure, they were negligent, that's not an explanation. That's just an observation, and it's a judgment call, a subjective judgment call. It's not even scientific. Violating procedure, that could be scientific, but the others are a judgment call. What we need to do is get out of this fix the person mantra because it's not that effective. The new view says, all right, let's be honest and openly admit what we did that caused the problem. What did the operator factually do or not do? But explain it. They did it because they believed X at the time. And that belief came from somewhere. It wasn't that they were just an idiot. It came from somewhere. It came from what information was observable to them, was not observable. How did the system handicap them? If they didn't follow a procedure, why? They don't flip a coin to say, oh, I'm not going to follow this procedure today. We got tails. That's not how this works. There is a reason for not following procedures, and we can identify that reason. Because if this person didn't follow the procedure, I can bet you someone else is going to find the same reason. We've got to figure out what it is. What do you think of this? Is this a good idea? Why are you guys laughing? The system's working fine. There's nothing wrong with my system. It's working as described, as intended. It's just the stupid operators who are using it wrong. Okay, you can have that opinion if you want, but guess what? It's not going to work. You can even fire Jim, and I guarantee the next guy is going to do the same thing because this is not about human error so much as it is about the system that induces it. Oh, but John, I can fix that. I'm going to put a label on the back. The label's going to say, don't use this for cooking. Okay, you can try that. Let me know how it works. You're going to have the same problem next month. Some ATC and some aviation examples. And I know we got some experts out there. And someone's going to say, well, I wouldn't have made that mistake. I'm better than him. You got to guard yourself a little bit. This is called hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, after I give you the answer and we know that it was a mistake, you're going to feel like it's obvious. That's hindsight bias. It was not obvious to the people before the mistake. That's what hindsight bias means. It makes you say, why in the world would they do that? I know to listen for an acknowledgement. Why would they do that? Next time you ask that question, I want you to realize something. That is a really good question. Why would they do that? The fact that you're asking that question tells me you don't know the answer. And that's your job, if you're interested in safety, is to find out why. It indicates a lack of understanding on your part. And if you don't find the answer, you're going to be clueless on how to prevent it. So this is what STAMP is all about. In fact, all this stuff is created well before STAMP. That's just basic human factors and systems thinking. STAMP says, good idea. How do we actually apply this to our systems today? How do we actually do this? And the way you do it is you got to think about the interactions in your system, right? So you may have a controller. Controller could be a person, could be a maintenance worker, could be a piece of automation or something else. But you may have a controller. You got to map out what are they doing to control the system, what are the available control actions, raise or lower, pitch up, pitch down, whatever it is. What's the process model, which represents their beliefs about the outside world? Every human and every controller, this comes from control theory, makes decisions in part based on our beliefs. So we got to identify what are the beliefs that are driving decision making, and where do those beliefs come from? They're never random. They always have a reason. They're wrong, but they have a reason. And the reason often is from feedback. There's other places, but feedback is a big one. Feedback that we collect from the process we're monitoring. Feedback that could be misleading, could be contradictory, could be delayed, and other ththings that we can look for. And we want to do this to look at how humans may physically work with a process, could be maintenance technicians. Look at how humans are working with automation. Like maybe we have some of that in air traffic control. We have some of that in cockpits with autopilot and other things. And we can actually use this to explain management behavior. Oh, you guys all thought I was talking about the workers up till now. No, actually, talking about everyone. Managers make mistakes too, don't they? We're human. What do you expect? The key is, though, it's not on purpose. Everything that I have said applies to management. We've got to be honest and upfront about openly admitting what were the actions taken, often days, months, years before, that contributed. We're going to be honest about that, because as soon as we do, we can figure out why. Because I guarantee if this manager thought that was reasonable, we're going to have others. What were the beliefs that drove that decision? Managers have beliefs too, don't they? We got to understand why it made sense at the time to do this thing. What were the beliefs driving the decision? Guess what? Management beliefs also don't come from flipping a coin. They come in part from feedback. Where does feedback come from? It comes from the operators and others, but it comes from the reports of things going wrong, problems we've uncovered. We can't expect managers to know everything, so we got to feed the information that's necessary at every layer in the control structure. And if we're missing that feedback, or it's not getting through, or if we're piping up the wrong feedback, you can't come crying home when the wrong decision gets made. So we got to understand this. We got to map this out, be real honest about it, and understand how the system is everything on the screen here, how the system and the structure is contributing to the problem, not just Jim over here. So we call these controllers just to avoid confusion. It could be a manager, could be a human worker, could be a piece of automation. They're all controllers. It's just a fancy word for decision maker. Every decision maker has a process model, even software, even AI, which this is being used for autonomous aircraft, that drive the beliefs that drive the decision making. So generally, you would have a control structure like this that maps this out, looks at the different layers of control in our system. There's never just one layer. And we're going to look at how every layer operates and gets confused because of the information available to them. So back to the jet bridge, we went over this already. Now you see why I did it quite like this. This is actually based in our understanding of decision making. But it doesn't tell the whole story, does it? This is just the worker bee. Guess what? There's a level of control up above, and this is true for that airline. For about a year before they called me up, they had all kinds of these incidents happening. They were providing incorrect procedures that were not effective. It's just a fact. It's not on purpose. It's not malicious. They're doing the best they could, but they were providing ineffective procedures. The equipment was not what the operators needed. When they went to select what equipment to purchase, it wasn't informed by this kind of insight. And so those stupid managers, let's figure out why it made sense. So what did the managers believe? They believed that the procedures were effective. That's interesting because they weren't. How could they believe that they were effective? What information was being piped up from the bottom? We had for a year before the first event people that weren't doing the rundowns because it was a waste of time and there's other things going on. And even if you did do a rundown, things would change and you'd still lower it onto a vehicle. So it actually wasn't effective. But how did that information get piped up to management? Actually, it didn't. We dropped the ball. And it can be hard in a bureaucratic structure, but we got to figure this out. Okay, so now's my build up to a couple aviation events. Uberlingen, an example, I would guess most of you are familiar with this. It's a famous crash. Two planes were on a collision course. One plane got a TCAS alert, which is a computer in the cockpit that helps you avoid collisions. And the TCAS computer told this plane to go down to avoid the collision. And then the human air traffic controller told the other guy to go down to avoid a collision, and they crashed. And it was a disaster. And one of the problems is if you the controller on the ground had no idea what TCAS was doing in the sky. It's not how that was a gap. But that's the way it works. Theoretically, the guy who got the TCAS to descend could have gotten on the radio and said, hey, I got a TCAS alert to descend, but he didn't. Other emergency, which had to do with the other plane, and there's also something else going on. And pilots know only one person can talk at a time. If you try to step on somebody by transmitting simultaneously, first thing you can do in an emergency. So you have to do this prioritization on the fly. Anyway, a lot of people blamed air traffic controllers for this. In fact, in 2002, they were found guilty. We have headlines like this: crash report blames the controller and the Russian pilots. In fact, one guy who lost his family killed the air traffic controller who's involved, Peter Nielsen. Went to his door and killed him in front of his family. That guy really blamed air traffic control, right? And then apparently when he went back to Russia, he was hailed as a hero for serving out justice. This is crazy. This is 1800s thinking. What can we do different? Well, we had a student at MIT that said, hey, this stamp sounds like a nice idea. Let's try applying this to Uberlingen. And he mapped out all the information theoretically available to a controller on the ground to avoid this kind of disaster. And it's not perfect. Like I said, the TCAS information is missing, unless the guy happens to phone it in on the radio. But there's a lot of other support systems. There's short-term conflict alerts. There's other ATC controllers you could talk to. There's managers that monitor the load, the workload, and can assign other people to take over when you need to. And so it's pretty robust. However, over time, these practices and procedures slowly changed. Some eroded because they weren't seen as critical. Some were taken down because of construction that was approved, and nobody thought it was going to be a problem. And on the day of the event, this is what they were left with. Whoa. Maybe it wasn't just Peter's fault. Maybe the system around him was really making it hard for him to do the job. Some of the support systems Peter didn't even know were down. Nobody told him. And he was relying on them to inform him when certain alerts happened. But they were silent. Wow. There's more going on here than just Peter. His mistakes, if you want to call it that, are very understandable. Now, I'm not saying that they were right. They were a mistake. We know in hindsight there's things that could have gone better. But we can also explain why they didn't go better by looking at the system. There's a lot more on this. There's about 100 pages written on the stamp applied to this if anyone wants to look it up. But let me move on to another case that you won't find written up. Northwest 188. This is an accident report if anyone's interested. You may recall about 10 years ago, a plane went from San Diego to Minneapolis. About halfway through the country, radio contact was lost. And it flew through 3 air traffic control sectors, and everyone on the ground thought they were in contact with the plane, but they weren't. That's very strange, huh? How can that happen? Well, it did. All 3 thought the same thing. There's only the 4th sector that figured out they lost contact. And then they're trying to fix the contact issue, but they can't get in touch with the plane. And the plane flew past the airport by 10 minutes. In the NTSB, there's no because it's not 10. I know which things. And on the wrong frequency. That's just factually what happened. But let's understand why. We can't stop here. What was the context around the pilots? What were they getting from ATC or not getting from ATC or from the aircraft equipment and other things? So let's look at what they believed. They believed they were on the correct frequency. They weren't, but they believed they were. Why? Now, someone's going to list all the reasons the pilots should have known better. Here's the problem with that. I know that list, and it's not on the slide. Here's why. It's not actually useful to us. It's an alternate reality where the pilots made a different decision. That's not what happened. I want to understand what happened, not this fictional universe you can construct. I want to understand what informed their belief and made them think they were on the right frequency, because that's the only way we're going to get to recommendations and to fix it. And so the normal amount of ATC radio chatter. They also didn't receive their call sign. So they were told to switch frequencies. They switched frequencies. Something went wrong with the acknowledgement. We can only guess what went wrong there. I'll tell you later. In the Uberlingen case. And so is a radio check-in more critical than an emergency that's being resolved? Yeah, probably not. Most pilots would probably wait. It was actually critical to a pilot because here's how they process that information. In a cockpit, you have to detect when the radio's not working. How do you detect? It's not all about a red light. You listen. If you hear normal chatter, that tells you it's working. If it goes silent, that's what tells you something's gone wrong. It's very eerie in a cockpit when the radio goes silent for a period of time. It's like a wake-up call. And so that's one of the things they were sensitive to, and it didn't happen. They had normal amount of radio chatter, never went silent, and so that told them that there's no action necessary. Also, they're listening for the call sign. You don't listen to every word that's transmitted as a pilot, because most of them are not for you. They're not relevant to you. You listen for your name, which is your flight, and that's your wake-up. And so they were doing what all pilots do, passively listening to this chatter without consciously interpreting it all, just waiting for the call sign to be called, and it was never called on the frequency they were on. It appears, this is a guess because we don't know for sure, but it appears that they dialed in the wrong frequency, which happens all the time, by the way, because it's very convoluted. There's two dials, an inner and outer, and you have to rotate one and then the other, and you have to increment the number one by one until you get the frequency you were told. And by that time, you've forgotten. So it actually happens all the time, pilots dial in the wrong frequency. But usually, if you dial in a random frequency, you'll hear static or nothing, and you know right away it was the wrong one. If someone dials in the wrong frequency, but it's a valid ATC frequency, figure out that that's a problem. If something goes wrong with the moment. We're okay. Window of time. We don't. And one layer of defense was ACARS. ACARS is never conceived to be safety critical in theory. In practice, it often is, but we kind of ignore that. And we claim that it's not safety critical. And ATC did try to use ACARS to pipe up the message about what's going on. And on some aircraft, it sounds an alarm, not an alarm, but a chime, so you know that you've got a new message. But not on this aircraft. On this aircraft, it's way down here. There's a little indication that comes on, but it's not part of your scan pattern as a pilot because it's not flight critical. It's supposed to be gate information for your crew, for your passengers, not critical frequency for ATC. And Airbus said, since it's not critical, you have to pay for the chime. And Northwest said, well, we're not going to pay for the chime because it's not critical. And so this pilot's had no notification at all. Problem and started looking for ACAS messages. Something like 50 ACARS messages in 30 minutes, and guess what? Not a the crew did eventually figure out something, and they did find the ACARS messages, and when you open it up, you have to go into a menu. Guess what's right next to the open button? Guess which one they hit by accident in their flurry of trying to figure this out? They hit the erase all. There's no undo. You can't get it back, and you can't contact ATC to tell them to give you another message. It doesn't work that way. Okay, they're in trouble. I mean, this is a classic human error slip, is what it's called. That is actually discovered in aviation. You'd think we'd know how to design better systems than that, but I guess we don't. There's an emergency radio, backup radio, just in case the first one fails, 121.5 megahertz. Only problem is it only has coverage over about 50% of the US. That is atrocious. And we have emergency locator transmitters. Hikers, they need to broadcast beeping sounds so someone comes to find them. What frequency do they use that they know is being monitored? 121.5. And guess what was reported in the area on the day of this problem? ELT interference on the emergency radio. So even if they were on the 50% of US that had reception, they had ELT interference. Well, that wasn't working. So if you piece this, and there's more, I just don't have time, but if you piece this all together, you start to realize, actually, there's a lot of information they don't have. Another critical piece of information is maps of what frequency you're supposed to be on. It's not like a grid pattern like New York City. It could be 5 minutes between frequency changes, or it could be 30 minutes, totally normal. You don't know because you don't have a map. You are 100% reliant on ATC to tell you when it's time. And if you don't hear that call, you're not going to think something's wrong. All right, so I guess it's not just Jim the pilot. But let's look at ATC now. Let's just be factual about it. And we do have to be open and honest about this. Well, they did provide a new handoff frequency to the pilots. It was the correct frequency. We had the recording. Pilots read it back correctly in the acknowledgement. And then nobody heard from the pilots again. Now, normally, when this happens, ATC will call the last working frequency. Usually when this happens, pilots will get on the last working, there's a return, the execute transfer button. It returns you to last working frequency in the cockpit of the plane. But that only works if ATC knows about it and tries to find you on the previous frequency. ATC never tried the last working frequency. Part of the problem is they didn't know what was the last working frequency. You can't look it up in their equipment that they have. There's no record of what frequency was last working for this plane. So if you catch it right away, you try the last sector and you're okay. If you don't catch it right away, who knows what the frequency was. They're also supposed to notify the military within a few minutes of a NORDO, that's no radio communication. That didn't happen. As I said, it flew through 3 sectors and nobody knew they lost communication. So that was a problem. Ever since 9/11, you have to do that. So there's some problems here. Let's figure it out. Let's understand why. What did they believe? Well, they believed they were in contact. So it's probably too small to see, but right in the middle there, they went through Sector 17, which was renamed to 18. That guy thought they were in contact. Then it went through Sector 8. That guy thought it was in contact with the plane, and then Sector 9. So they have an acknowledgement process that's carefully scripted so that you don't mess this up. What happened? Well, air traffic controllers have a really tough job. And I didn't fully appreciate this until I went to interview the guys who were involved. And then I shadowed their entire shifts to really get a sense of their operation. And it's insane, the stuff that these guys do. You've got 15 aircraft enter and exit your screen at peak hours, and you got to memorize which planes you've talked to. That's it. How do you do it? Are you superhuman or something? They say, well, no. Back in the day, we'd have these paper pen or something, and I'd give my own custom mark on the flight strip, and that's how I know, a little cue that I talked to this guy. But they replaced that with electronic flight strips now. And the thinking was, whatever's printed on the paper, just put it on an LCD screen. Who cares if it's on paper or LCD? It's going to be better on an LCD screen. And they faithfully reproduced what's printed out on paper, but guess what you can't do for an LCD screen? You can't get out your marker and put a checkbox. That functionality was totally missing. So I said, okay, so what do you do? Because you do this every day. And they said, well, we all do something different. So I interviewed a bunch of them. And about a third of them said, well, I clicked the flight strip, and it's highlighted in green on the picture there. And I said, okay, but you can only click one at a time. They said, yeah, that's true. When the next flight calls in, I lose that history. I can only mark one at a time. I said, that's not helping you track 15 planes. It's insane. What are we doing? So I talked to some more people, and the next third of controllers said, well, there's a comment block. Now, it's regulated. There's a syntax that you're allowed to use, but I violate that every day by putting in my personal code, which I decided was a \0. And that indicates to me that I talked to this plane. I just have to remember to backspace over it before it hands off to the next sector, because I could get in trouble for that. What? This is crazy, guys. And then it brings me to the last third of controllers I interviewed, and they said, well, I just forced myself to remember. And I said, what do you mean you force yourself to remember? Do you ever feel like maybe you missed one? And they say, oh yeah, every day. What? What? We are totally handicapping these guys. This is insane. All the effort that was spent in this upgrade, and nobody sat between how things work in practice and the automation you want to build. So we can write this down. There's more. This down, and we start to see this overwhelming information that's missing that they rely on to help them do a better job and catch this kind of problem. And when I went there, I asked the guy, it's kind of jokingly, I said, oh, so how many Nordos you get today? And I expected 0. And the guy says, oh, 10. And I said, what, for the whole facility, the Minneapolis en route facility? He said, oh, no, for my sector, I had 10. I said, oh, it's a bad day, huh? And he goes, no, today's a good day. We usually get 12 to 15. What? In fact, I showed up, and this military den line, it sounded like the world was going to end, like World War III. Like that was the atmosphere of this. They were very talkative. And I walked by, and I said, what's that about? Are they normally like that? I said, oh, no. What's happened is the president's flying into this airport, and we just lost radio contact with another plane flying into the airport at the same time. And I thought, whoa, we're going to have another 9/11. Wait till I get home and see the papers. This is going to be big. This is what I'm researching here. The systemic flaws that we have that haven't been fixed. Got home, nothing. Silence, nothing. It happened. I was there. But these things don't at least get into the public world. I hope that someone at ATC looked based on what I've heard from people. This is what it looks like when you do this kind of. You identify exactly what contributing action. Be open and honest about it, and then you explain what was reasonable. What were the beliefs that were driving those actions that's provided, or that was missing that create a belief over here as well. Things I've discussed, there's a lot more than this. And you start to realize, whoa, Jim, the controller on duty that. We've been lucky. Or not day that we'll lose communication. And the saving grace is usually ATC figures it out right away. Oh, one thing, I don't recall if I mentioned this already, but those 3 sectors, they had a shift change right in the middle of the flight going across the sector. And so when the new guy came to replace and did a frequency change off to the next sector, he didn't get an acknowledgement. And so the guy said, oh, he must have already been handed off by the previous guy. And it happened 3 times in a row. And when you entered a sector, the guy sitting there said, maybe he hasn't got the new frequency yet from the previous controller. There's an electronic handoff internally to ATC, but then there's the pilot handoff, and they're 2 different things. And they don't always happen in sync. It's maybe supposed to, but they don't actually happen always in sync. And so the guy on the ground saw the plane enter and said, oh, I'll give him a minute or two, because sometimes it's a minute late or two. And then he got replaced by the new controller. Now there's a shift change procedure actually provided from the FAA. Guess what's not on that procedure? Brief the communication status of the aircraft. That was missing. There's other stuff. There's about 7 or 12 things. That was nowhere on the procedure. And I talked to them, and they said, well, some of us do brief the communication status, but some of us don't. It's not required. So this is all kinds of, the onion unfolds. There's more. Human error is a symptom of everything in here is part of the system. And we don't do this to equipment or blame the pilots or anybody. We do it to what it's all about. You're going to hear a couple acronyms. CAST is the other aviation CAST. That's an unfortunate the past to learn more deeply about what went wrong. STPA says, hey, if you could do it for a past event, why can't you do it for a future event? Actually, it's not too hard. A lot of the bullet points up here, you could have done without having an accident occur. And that's what STPA says. If you're changing a procedure, if you're buying new equipment, or you're building something new, you can use STPA to anticipate before it happens what kind of confusion is going to happen in your system so you can prevent it. The FAA is very well aware of this, at least pockets within the FAA. Others, I don't think I've ever seen this before. But they did a study a little while ago. They teamed up with ICAO, EASA, ANAC, and NASA, subject matter experts on aviation safety management. And they all reviewed STPA and STAMP and identified, should this be a part of an industry safety processes? And 100% of them said yes. I was sure one of them was going to say no. But not even one said no. They all unanimously said yes. And then I said, okay, do you think it will actually happen, given what you understand about the industry? 86% said yes. I thought they'd all say no. They said it's only a matter of time before this trickles in. People just need to be aware of it. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today. If you're interested to read more, there's a website. By the way, it might sound like I'm a salesperson. I apologize, and I regret that. I'm actually not. MIT is a nonprofit. You don't have to pay for any of this. Our mission is to create knowledge, make it freely available to the world. So there's free handbooks, free video tutorials, and there's a workshop like this one on the East Coast that's held once a year. If you're interested, feel free to sign up. You can email me. You can reach me on LinkedIn if you want. Now I want to hand it over to American Airlines to talk about how they've been implementing this process. American Airlines has been using this for a few years now. They started actually in the middle of COVID. They had money to burn. To not only improve safety, but to improve efficiency and performance. Team together to become experts. And they've got of this team to talk. But I hope it's enough. Stephen Paliak.
And it's an honor is here. And just to kind of before set the stage, we're the world's largest airline. Heard, hey, we've been doing this for almost 100 years. What can you tell us different than we haven't been doing before? And that's why we adopted STAMP, and it is a new way of looking at it, how we apply STPA and CAST, which I'm going to get to. But before I jump into the systems engineering part of it, I'd be remiss to not mention how American Airlines is really being innovative and trying to be the industry leader in our safety programs. And looking in our do have a booth here, and we'd love to talk more about them. But some of them are current safety programs, being our LOSA, which is our peer-to-peer observations system. We're introducing that to multiple of our work groups. Our ASAP, we're expanding to different work groups. Our LIT team, Learning Improvement Team, where we're focusing on those resilient behaviors and how we learn from them. But today, I'm going to go into more detail about our systems engineering team, which is my team. I'm going to talk about our structure and how American Airlines has implemented this, right? What I call our key to success. And then after that, I'm going to show you a real live example of how we've actually used it. So like John Thomas just mentioned, we did create a team, our safety systems engineering team, which is led by myself and 3 of our expert project managers. Now, we're not the experts in the operation, we're not pilots, and we're not mechanics, but we are project managers, and we facilitate these projects. The next thing we have is our steering committee, or safety steering committee. This is our managing directors in safety. These help provide the resources needed to do these projects. Now, doing a CAST or an STPA is not an overnight process. Some of them take weeks. STPA can take months. It's a large process. Then we have our executive steering committee. So all the VPs, senior VPs of our operating departments, they're all going to be sitting on the board to help give us the resources and time needed for these projects, and they all also happen to be the accountable executives for their own SMS and their own departments. So then for each project that we have, we need sponsors, right? People from what we call the business units, right? And the flight operations and airports and our in-flight team, for them to sign off and be able to help provide and represent their company or their business. And then we have a project group, right? So we have a project group which is really consisted of our facilitator, which is someone from our team, and safety. I should have mentioned that before, that my team, we're in the safety organization, so we're not within the business and the operating departments like our flight team or our airports. So we have one of our expert facilitators, our process owners, which are the people who own the policy and procedures, our union teams on the front line. From all the different business units, they come together